Hello and welcome to tonight's show. Marianne Williamson is a long shot outsider running for president. She's currently primarying Joe Biden, but rather than be met with an open democratic process, she's being either ignored or smeared and denied any opportunity for debate. Now, you may remember Marianne from her previous run for president in the 2020 election. She was typecast as an energy-seeking, crystal-loving spiritual guru and relentlessly made fun of. But this time around, more people are taking her much more seriously. In particular, younger voters hungry for change. They view Marianne as someone who will genuinely focus on the people of this country and the myriad of problems the people face. They view her as someone who isn't part of the old guard, and they love her. Now, one thing we should all have learned from the 2016 presidential race when Donald Trump won the election is you should never discount anyone. You should never laugh off a candidate thinking they aren't serious. Marianne is very serious, and a lot of voters like Marianne. She's growing in the polls. Nearly 10% of Biden voters currently will be switching their vote to Marianne, and that number continues to climb. And the night is still young. So before we get into our conversation with presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, we need to talk about our sponsors, of course. Field of Greens is one of my favorites. I love this stuff. It is a fine powder made from dehydrated whole fruits and vegetables that are carefully selected to give you the most nutrients in your diet possible. You just take the scoop of powder, you mix it into your ice water or your iced tea, and it actually tastes really delicious. And it's just an easy way to get all of your fruits and vegetables into your diet. And when you get your fruits and vegetables in your diet, you're gonna crave less junk, you're gonna have more energy, you're gonna sleep better. Of course, you're gonna have the other side effects like healthy skin and hair, and you're gonna start losing weight. All of that stuff's gonna happen when you start feeding your body the nutrients it needs. I personally really love the lemon lime flavor, but you can also get mixed berry. They also have an energy version. There's also other products on the website that you might want to try, like they've got some metabolism boosting pills called Lean, a variety of products there. Whichever products you choose, just go to the website fieldofgreens.com, use the promo code Kim, and you're going to get 15% off your first order, any of the products that you want to try from Brickhouse. That includes Field of Greens and many of their others. So again, go to fieldofgreens.com, use the promo code Kim, and get 15% off your first order. Marianne, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kim. It's nice to see you again.
It's great to see you. So you're one of the only, right now, I believe, two people willing to challenge Joe Biden in the race. What made you want to challenge Joe Biden when so many others are unwilling? When you ran previously, there was a lot of you on the stage at that time in the previous Democratic primary. Now it's just you, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Joe Biden. What compelled you to run against him?
Well, I don't think that the incremental neoliberal vision that the corporate Democrats, in this case Joe Biden, represent will, number one, even defeat the Republicans in 2004. But more importantly, I don't think that they're enough to repair this country. I think this country is on the wrong track. Most Americans agree with that. And I think we need to make a U-turn. We're headed straight for the iceberg. And I think that the incremental approaches represented by people like the president means that we will take a little bit longer to get to the iceberg, and we'll hit it at a different angle, but we'll still hit it. I think we need an economic U-turn. I think we need to face the fact that we have had a 50-year aberrational chapter of our history. We need to look in the mirror in a lot of areas and make wise, responsible, and conscious moves to turn this thing around.
What policies in particular do you feel like Joe Biden, his administration, is being incrementalist on that you would not, that you would go more aggressively, you would aggressively face?
Well, let's remember, 70% of Americans now say that they live with financial stress. So you have 20% of Americans who live in a place where, the economy is pretty good, 20% in the richest country in the world. So you've got 70 to 80% of Americans who represent a vast sea of everything from economic anxiety on a constant level to genuine economic despair. We have 1 in 4 Americans living with medical debt, 68,000 people who die every year from lack of health care. We have Americans who are rationing their insulin, putting GoFundMe pages up on the internet. None of this happens in any other advanced democracy because they have universal health care. In the 1970s, we had a thriving middle class in this country. The average worker had decent benefits, could afford to send their kids to college, could afford a yearly vacation, could afford a car, could afford a home. When I was growing up, Blue Cross Blue Shield was a nonprofit. Until the 1960s and 70s, you had tuition free or near tuition free college at public colleges and universities all over this country. Today, as you well know, we have done such a massive transfer, not only of wealth, but with the opportunities that go with wealth and the opportunities for greater wealth creation have been so moved into the hands of 1% that you have to be part of that 1% to have easy access to healthcare, to education, and so forth. When you say, what would I do? To me, it's a matrix of corporate entities that represent the corporatocracy and the corporate tyranny in this country. And it's also a matrix of policies that represent a genuine economic U-turn. We need universal health care. We need free or near free public colleges and universities and tech schools. We need free childcare. We need paid family leave. We need an economic bill of rights, which is what I've written all this up in. And we need guaranteed sick pay. We need guaranteed living wage. The president
Yeah.
has said, now this goes back to what you asked about the president. So the president said we're going to lift the minimum wage, which should be the bare minimum. We have 1/3 of America's workforce who live on less than $15 an hour and can't even afford, half Americans can't afford a one-bedroom apartment, Kim. So the president said we're going to lift the minimum wage. Well, he did it for federal workers. Then when it came time to extending it further, the parliamentarian says you can't. Really, Kim, can you imagine the Republicans being stopped by the parliamentarian? The president has said that he would veto a Medicare for all bill. And now, added to all this, you have the president having approved the Willow Project. You have him giving more oil drilling permits even than Trump. So he represents what corporate Democrats do. They want to help people on the periphery. They want to help people survive what is essentially an unjust system, but they are unwilling to challenge the underlying forces, mainly corporate forces, that make the return of all that suffering inevitable. And that's what has to change. It's not incremental. It's a fundamental economic reform that we need in this country.
So being president would be, that's one person, very powerful person for sure, consolidated power to that one in many ways, but you're still battling the machine, right? There's a lot of other players involved who help steer this ship. So how would you get around the interests of others who are maybe members of Congress or even people that advisors who are still trying to placate those corporate interests who want to say, no, we don't want, we want to continue making money. We're doing great. Our business is fantastic. We're billionaires. Who cares what is happening to the middle and lower class?
Well, first of all, no matter who the president is, you hope to have your own party in charge of Congress, in charge of the Senate. You may not. The president, whoever the president is, does not have a magic wand. And we actually don't want the president to have a magic wand. The presidency, one of three co-equal branches of government. However, you asked before, why aren't any other progressives who are part of that system running? Hello, good question. They're not, because they are caged within that system. And they know that if they at this point defied the Democratic elite establishment, that they would lose their committee assignments. The DNC would come after them on the level of the primary and fund their opponents next time. I'm not part of that machine. I'm going in there to kind of give a chiropractic adjustment to this country, get us back aligned with what really the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, everything I mentioned, would I be able to go in there by fiat and just make all those things happen? No, I wouldn't. But I could do a lot. I could definitely put a lot of pressure on this whole issue of agency capture. Who the president appoints as the heads of these agencies makes a lot of difference. If you're going to appoint somebody from Big Ag to be head of the Department of Agriculture, if you're going to see this as dual advocacy, then we're going to stay where we are. I would not do that. I would, of course, have the power of the executive orders. And I would have the bully pulpit. And I think you know enough about me to know I would say it like it is.
The
And if
bully
I'm in there
pulpit
for 4
is,
years,
go ahead.
well, if I'm in there for 4 years and I've made certain changes, then I get to leave at the end of 4 years and say, to the Republicans and to the corporate Democrats, just try to change it back and see how the people will like it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Once the change is made and people actually like that change, they're not going to be changing it back. It's going to be pretty much impossible to do. And that's it. So that's interesting. You mentioned if you're just there for 4 years, would you be running? Would you be fine with only being in the White House for 4 years? Do you feel like you could make more change in the 4 years rather than an 8-year term?
I know this. There is no way that I could effectuate the changes I want to effectuate if I was thinking about getting reelected.
Right. Okay. That's actually very smart. Yeah, because if you are sitting there thinking constantly about being reelected, then the first 4 years is almost useless, right? You're just there trying to placate and make people happy. What kind of pushback or response at all are you getting from the Democratic establishment, the party itself?
Hit piece after hit piece, sneer after sneer, diminishment after diminishment, lie after lie. I mean, everything from their minions at places like The View and the political rags to the press secretary at the White House. It's kind of extraordinary. It's not really extraordinary, but it's quite something.
Yeah, why do you think they're protecting Joe Biden so much? I mean, you're running as a Democrat, so wouldn't they be thrilled if a Democrat, to them it should just be a Democrat wins, right? I mean, they shouldn't be playing favorites, really. So what do you think it is, the underlying root cause as to why they're so protective of Joe Biden in particular? Do they think that, yeah, why do you think it is?
Same reason they were protective of Hillary Clinton. I mean, look what they did to Bernie. Poll after poll showed Bernie could beat Trump. I mean, this is not, this manipulation of the system by the DNC, unfortunately, is not anything new at this point. They feel that they can shoehorn in the president. They feel he won in 2020. He's the answer to winning in 2024. Now, democracy means that that should be the decision made by the voters. And
Yeah.
traditionally, the party stays in the background. The party should be facilitating democracy, not obstructing or thwarting democracy. Traditionally, they stay in the background, the voters weigh in, the electorate decides, and then the party supports that candidate. But we've been through 16, we've been through 20. So this is nothing new. They're entitled belief that they get to decide. It's like it's 100 years ago, and a bunch of men sitting around a table smoking cigars and just deciding who the candidate would be. And now you're seeing that people aren't so happy with that. It's interesting.
Are they reaching out to you at all? Have you had any communication whatsoever with the DNC?
Their communication is through their hit pieces. They're
Wow, that's it.
communicating
So
through.
they're not trying to
I know.
communicate with you any other way other than just through the press with hit pieces.
One person said to someone I know, "Why is she doing this?" But no, they don't. They don't play like that. That's not how those people hang.
Why do you think none of the other Democrats who some of them viscerally attacked Joe Biden on the debate stage the last time around, why do you think none of them are stepping forward and putting their hat in the ring? I mean, we're seeing on the Republican side lots of people jumping into the race, challenging former President Donald Trump. They seem to have no problem with that on the Republican side. They don't have any guise of like, well, he was the president, so we need to support him in round two. A very different dynamic over there. Why do you think Democrats are so unwilling to challenge Joe Biden? Again, what would it matter to the Democratic Party if a Democrat wins? Which Democrat wins? It shouldn't matter, right? As long as that Democrat could potentially defeat the GOP. So why do you think they're just what do you think why are they not jumping in? This is just so mind-boggling to me.
They're towing the line. It has been decided by the corporate elite that this is Joe's turn, and they're going to wait till 2028. Now, what's so horrifying about that to me is that if you think that it's as simple as waiting until your turn until 2028, you lack the sense of urgency that is necessary for this historical moment. To me, you have to be really buffered, emotionally buffered from the suffering that is going on out there. You have to be emotionally buffered from a recognition of what the threat of climate change means right now. You have to be emotionally buffered from this moment to think that your career waiting in my turn is more important than somebody saying what needs to be said at this moment. So it's not a surprise to me, whether it's Bobby Kennedy, whether it's Cornel West, not a surprise to me that we're all from outside that system
Yeah.
because those who are really willing to disrupt it are.
I'm just wondering why somebody like Bernie Sanders isn't jumping back in. He's somebody that uh, has never really, I don't even think he's not a Democrat, right? But he's always been challenging of the system. So, I'm just so it's very mind-boggling as to why so many people, including people like Bernie Sanders, seem to be wanting to protect Joe Biden and preserve the Joe Biden presidency. Um, I
In
don't know if you have
terms
any
of
thoughts
his
on that.
running again, In terms of his running again, I think his age might have something to do with that. What did
Okay,
surprise me was the way he came out day one, as soon as Biden announced, said, I'm not running. And he effectively said, I don't think anybody else should either, which
right.
surprised and disappointed a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah, so you're not expecting any endorsements from somebody like
No,
Bernie
he's made that
Sanders.
clear. Oh, he's made
Okay,
that clear. He's endorsed Joe Biden, my friend Joe. Bernie is a institutionalist, and I assume what he's thinking is we've got to get Biden back in there, get two more senators, and then we can get something like Build Back Better passed. I'm assuming that's where he's coming from. He has the right to see it the way he sees it. Obviously, I see it differently.
yeah, I just there's yeah. I mean, I'm not going to beat the dead horse, but it does just feel like what does it matter if it's to Bernie, if it's Joe Biden, I suppose, if he thinks that he's going to carry out some agenda that Bernie Sanders likes, or if it's you who's going to carry out other agendas that Bernie Sanders likes. What's the difference to the Democratic Party? What's the difference to these other Democrats? They should be picking the person they actually support the most and
Yeah,
backing
you're
that
like
person.
me. We have this la la land nostalgic view of the Democratic Party, right? And if only it would be the Democratic Party I grew up with. Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
nice, wouldn't it?
Or
Yeah,
right,
I think
that
those,
believed in democracy for sure.
right. And I think those of us who are running as Democrats are hearkening to a time when the Democratic Party worked differently and stood for unequivocal advocacy for the working people of the United States. And I sort of here to try to reclaim the soul of the party.
So before I want to get into a lot of the policy issues, and we're going to definitely dive into those. But before I want to kind of do one last roundup on this whole DNC and Biden debacle. Um, in the end, when they say Joe Biden's the guy, he's the nominee, he's the person on our ticket. Last time they required, or I believe they required all of you to say Joe Biden's the guy, I support you. Was there a piece of paper that you all had to sign?
There's nothing like that. There never was last time. And I endorsed Bernie when I dropped out.
So, would you be endorsing Joe Biden if it comes down to it and it's Joe Biden and let's say Donald Trump wins the GOP nomination? Are you going to say, I back Joe Biden because you don't want Donald Trump to win?
I don't think I owe it to anybody to answer that question. This is what I know. Like I'm sure you and millions of us, will do whatever we feel we can do to keep the fascists out of the White House. That's my commitment. My commitment is not to my party. My commitment is to my country. And where that aligns with the interests of the party, yeah.
Who are the fascists?
Fascists are those who believe that the power of the state, particularly the power of the state when it is combined with corporate power, actually should override the dictates of democracy as they are illuminated and elucidated both in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. State power, corporate power, over the power of the individual, over the power of a representative democracy.
Is our current president a fascist then, by that
Not
definition?
in, not
You
in
don't
my
think so?
mind. Listen, no. I mean, there are things he does that I like, some things he does that I don't like, but no, I don't think Joe Biden is a fascist. No.
But by that definition, it sounds to me like the Democratic establishment would be fascists. I mean, they certainly both sides, both parties are basically two cheeks of the same ass. They're both
Corporatists, so
very
definitely.
right. They're corporatists
Listen,
and they're bought out, and they're not catering to the will of the people. They're catering to the will of their donors, which are the large corporations. So wouldn't that make them all fascists?
no. I don't believe that. I believe that there is, first of all, I think that there's degree. Second of all, obviously, there's a struggle at the heart of the Democratic Party now, just like there's a struggle at the heart of the Republican Party. I think that there are high minded conservative and high minded liberal principles. And, when America works the way America should work, we understand nobody has a monopoly on truth, but we are all joined by these underlying agreements about the principles on which we purport to stand. And then there are those who do not respect those principles. But the corporatists, to me, and the corporatists definitely are headquartered in both parties. But I think the corporatists in the Democratic Party, like I said before, they seem to have a recognition that there's a lot of suffering going on out there, and they seek to assuage it. They seek to alleviate the stress. They seek to alleviate the pain on the periphery, but they will not challenge the underlying corporate forces that make the return of all that pain inevitable. But that doesn't mean necessarily to me that they're fascist. When people start saying you can or cannot teach this course in school, when people say you cannot have an undocumented worker in your car or in your home, that's a felony. When you start telling librarians what they can and cannot have on their shelves, when you start telling people what they can or cannot read, then you're getting over into fascism at that.
So authoritarianism, when you start to take on that authoritarian streak where you're wanting to tell people how to live their lives or what they must do or what they can and cannot do, that's to you when it. What do you think then of like vaccine mandates that were very much pushed by Democrats?
It's interesting because in 2020, I'd made a comment about vaccine mandates. And and look how Big Pharma and its minions and the mainstream media came after me. Look how they came after me. It's so interesting because some of the same people that smashed me in 2020 are now making excuses for somebody else who's saying far more than I said this time. Listen, it's funny. Bobby Kennedy, I wouldn't call him a friend. I call him an acquaintance. So I've known him. We both Los Angeles, right? And for years, especially living in LA, I heard a lot of, particularly mothers, Kim, women who were like PhDs in chemistry, who were asking very legitimate questions about the bundling of childhood vaccines, about how many chemicals were in each one, about how frequently they were given, unlike what was happening in Europe. And I saw what was being done to these women and how they were being demonized. I saw how I went through this in the 2020 campaign, having just made a comment about mandates. I saw what happened because to me, the issue of Big Pharma is not just about vaccines. I began to question why so many people are on antidepressants. I recognize that antidepressants are very, very good for some people, but clearly a profit center. This idea, we know how predatory pharmaceutical executives can be. We know what the Sackler family did. We know what happened with the opioid crisis. So I was saying in 2020, why are we assuming that Big Pharma is a bunch of holier than thou, pure-hearted people? And I saw how I got smashed down. I was ambushed by Anderson Cooper on CNN on that topic. And I said to him, I said, well, who do you think the main advertisers are on your show? And he said, I don't know who my advertisers are. And I wish that I'd had the nerve. It's one of those things where I spent a lot of time, I wish I'd said this, I wish I'd said that. I wish I'd said, oh, really? You expect us to believe that? I thought you had a segment, Anderson, called Keeping Them Honest. So, yes, there are some lines there that I'm not happy with sometimes.
Yeah. Another one of the sort of culture war issues that has been going on right now is the trans debate, the LGBTQ trans issues. You mentioned, you're not okay with the censoring of certain materials in schools or these sorts of discussions. And I'm curious where you fall with something that there was actually a survey that was done. It was done actually in the UK, but I think it resonates even for people here in the United States, where they asked a variety of things like, should trans be banned from using opposite gender bathrooms? So they asked these very, very specific questions. And one of them being, should trans athletes, let's say a biological male, be allowed to compete in biological female sports? And it was interesting in the divide on this graph, the left and the right in the UK, liberals, conservatives, and how pretty much everybody agreed on a couple of points, but then they started to diverge. But one of the things that they agreed on was about biological males and females and sports. The bathroom issue started to split depending on whether or not the trans person had had bottom surgery. That seemed to be a deciding factor for a lot of people. They felt like, well, if they've had the surgery, then I guess. If they haven't, then no. I'm just curious, where do you fall on the whole, on those, let's say those two issues in particular?
Well, first of all, I want to talk about the bigger issue, which is just this really horrifying bigotry against transgender Americans. One of the reasons I want to be president is because I want to help realign our public policies with the principles on which we purport to stand. All men are created equal. All people are created equal. God gave inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'm very concerned about what's happening to transgender Americans right now. I was asked to speak at a protest rally at East Tennessee University. That was the night before a law went into effect against drag shows and transgenders, which fortunately a federal judge has now struck down. I do think of transgender Americans as a kind of canary in the coal mine, as if I were president, day one, I would give special status and special protection status to transgender Americans. I would have my Department of Justice vigorously look into any suggestion of civil rights violations and prosecute in the same way. What was happening? You're in LA again. Just what happened? I think yesterday or the day before, with some transgender issues, and of course, maybe a girl. I don't know if you've ever interviewed maybe a girl who would be the first transgender person in Congress. So, in terms of recognizing the larger rights of transgender, it's extremely important to me. Many transgender people that I know believe that no irreversible surgery should be done before 18. That is people that I know who are transgender. And also in terms of the sports issue, listen, the girls who are biological, who cannot possibly compete in those situations should be protected also. But there are ways to chemically monitor that. There are ways to chemically determine whether or not in a particular situation, a particular race would be fair. And they should be very strict rules, and they should be left to the sports officials in those particular areas. It should be fair to everyone.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of agreement on a lot of aspects of the trans debate. And I do wish that people would focus more on the agreement. And then, but it does seem to, on both sides, have become, just like any issue, I suppose, like real radical, right, on each side. They kind of take something and
Yeah.
run with it in a very extreme way. So, um, curious, when it comes to like pronouns, do you think people who use improper pronouns or I should say the unpreferred pronoun, should they be punished or censored from social media in any way?
Oh, I think people should do what they want to do in America. To me, the point is be who you want to be, do what you want to do, use the pronouns you want to use, have a life, have a great time, and as long as you don't hurt anyone else, that's cool. That
Do you
to me
think
is the
do you think it's harmful for a person to use to call someone a he when when they've transitioned to a she? Do you think that verbal usage of that pronoun is harmful?
I think it's insulting.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's insulting. Yeah, I think
So maybe you're
yeah,
just an ass, but you shouldn't be censored from
yes,
social media.
exactly. Of
Yeah.
course, you can't. Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay. So people have the right to be an ass. That's kind of that's,
And that's kind of a basic American principle. That you can't
right.
have freedom. You can't have freedom and tell people you're not allowed to be a jerk.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
You
Right.
know,
Okay. So you could be a jerk. If you want to be a jerk, be a jerk. By all means. Okay.
and there is such a thing as healthy shame. There is such a thing as saying to somebody, "I don't think that was right," but that doesn't mean you make something illegal.
Right. Or make it okay. I understand what you're saying. So let's get into inflation and the economy. This is a big one, and it's probably going to be the determining factor of the entire presidential election, quite frankly. Even though people do care about many other issues like the Russia-Ukraine war, which we could talk about, border crisis, Israel is another big, there's a lot of other issues that people are concerned with. But I'd say inflation and economy is definitely going to be number one. What do you think has caused the current inflation? What would you do as president of the United States to correct it?
First of all, I think the main factor is corporate greed. That's the main factor. Food companies, so many companies that absolutely know that they're taking advantage of desperate people in a desperate population and raising their prices. And each one of those CEOs should be hauled before Congress and should have to speak in front of the American people about what possible excuse they have for taking advantage and exploiting a population during a time like this. That's number one. The second question was, well, first of all, I want to say something. If people had universal health care, if people had a living wage, if people didn't have these college loans, the problem is not just inflation. The problem is that the majority of people are living on the edge already. If you have the majority of people who are living in a survival mode, then they can't take the slightest deviation from that which they can just handle. So
Yeah.
then, when you throw a hit of inflation, our situation should be far more. People should be able to be buffered from something. Inflation. Sometimes inflation just happens in terms of global markets, and when I say it just happens, I mean it's not always under the direct control of someone like certainly the president of the United States. But people can't absorb it. That's the bigger problem with a lot of the issues that confront us is people are not in a situation when you have 60% of Americans, up to 64, some people say, who could not handle an unexpected $400 expenditure, then of course a period of inflation is absolutely devastating to them. A period of inflation should not be so devastating. And obviously, it should not be so taken advantage of by these corporate, soulless, sociopathic corporate forces.
Well, you make a really great point. Inflation comes and goes. It's
That's
just
right.
kind of part of the economy, and it doesn't seem to matter who's in office or who isn't. Inflation just comes and goes. And the population should be able to be resilient enough to withstand those periods of inflation, but we're not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, 20% are, and that 1% sure is.
Yeah, yeah, and there's definitely a good point you're making there. A lot of these companies are taking advantage of the inflation, and they're saying, "Well, it's inflation, so people will just we're
Let
having to
the
pay
market
more for this." Yeah,
because
companies that go ahead.
that's how the tentacles of a soulless hypercapitalism work. They're like a heat-seeking missile for any place where there might be a profit center. And no place is more of a petri dish that they for them to suck on and make a profit center than a place where people are desperate. That's what's so unethical about it. That's what's so
Sure.
unethical.
Okay, so I understand your point of, if the people were more robust and able to withstand, and they would be able to withstand inflation if they weren't worrying about, I got to pay all these student loan bills, which I know is a huge stress for a lot of people in my inner circle where there's been a
Medical
pause on
debt,
those.
like,
Right. There's medical debts, there's student loans, the high cost of living, just rent or mortgages are extremely high. So, yeah, when you tack on gas prices and food prices skyrocketing, it gets really bad. And you're saying that these corporations are taking advantage, and I do agree that there's a lot of that. I do think that there's a lot of very healthy companies that have a lot of profit. They get a spike in their supply chain costs because of higher rates of gas, and they pass it on to the customer rather than just absorbing it like they could and should. So they're instead inflating. But what could you do as president to stop that? Are you going to what would be the play to get them to stop this practice, this predatory practice?
well, the president actually does not have a direct, the president doesn't have a magic wand on that one. I think a large part of the power of the presidency at a time like this is the bully pulpit. More Americans need to understand what you and I just said. And when you understand what you and I just said, then you are more willing to elect people. And people need to understand that this has to go on the level of the primary. When we were talking about the DNC suppressing presidential candidates, they do the same thing on the level of congressional and senatorial candidates. Obviously, it's this unfettered corporate power. Like you were saying, they're the ones who should be absorbing the supply chain costs. If you have Look at something like the medical debt. You have 1 in 4 Americans, as I said, living with medical debt. You have an $88 billion medical debt. But if you look at the top 5 pharmaceutical companies last year alone, their profit was $80 billion.
Yeah.
So this should simply not be allowed. And of course, these companies should be paying a lot higher taxes.
Yeah. Let's move to the border. The border is in crisis. There's a lot of people wanting to get into the country, and just curious, what do you? There's obviously different ideas on how to handle the border. Curious what your idea is.
First of all, it's interesting that you said the border is in crisis. So let's talk about the real crisis. I'll tell you what the crisis is. The crisis is the humanitarian crisis of all these thousands of people, so many of whom are seeking to escape situations of such incredible violence beyond what most of us can even imagine in our lives. Think how bad things have to be for you to be willing to take a long journey, a very dangerous journey with 2 children. Think what that has to be. So, can we be clear about who really has the crisis here? That's the first thing. Notice the narrative, the official narrative here about the crisis at the border. And it's also a crisis that over the last few decades, Congress has not done its job. Congress
Right.
has not done its job. When Ronald Reagan was president, first of all, he gave amnesty to millions of people, something like at least 6 million people. Also, when I was growing up, if you wanted to be registered, all you had to do was walk over to the registry office. A lot of this is born of the systemic demonization of immigrants. Asylum is sacrosanct. The very notion of asylum is sacrosanct. It's we are we're losing our moral authority because we're losing the humanitarian principles that are at the core of all this. Are we going to just take down the Statue of Liberty, or are we just going to take down the Emma Lazarus poem? Give me your hungry, your huddled masses yearning to be free. So that's the first thing. What is the real crisis here? The real crisis is that we don't have enough legal ports of entry. We don't have enough ways to actually allow people uh, to come in legally. And I think the crisis here is a philosophical crisis. We must push back against the lies and the demonization that are being promulgated. Even one of my opponents who said we must make the border impermeable. He said, "What are you talking about here? That's like Donald Trump talking. How are we going to make it impermeable? We're going to make it impermeable what? Through cement, through a wall, or through soldiers?" He said we should have detention. No, 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 no. We have to recognize, one of the reasons I believe that I would be a good president is because I want to help this country look in the mirror. This country has to come to terms with how our policies in Latin America for decades have contributed to the kind of economic and social instability that has been the petri dish out of so much of this horror has arisen. That's the real crisis, what we call the crisis at the border. No, the crisis at the border is the crisis in American policy and in American outlook that leads us, that makes us fail to realize what's really going on in the lives of these people. Which, unless you were descended from slaves or descended from indigenous, Native Americans, who do you think your grandparents were? Who do you think your ancestors were? My grandparents all came through Ellis Island with as much desperation as these people at the border today.
So let's now talk and move on to foreign policy, since you bring it up with Latin America. Many of the disastrous foreign policies that the United States enacted in Latin America sort of created these crises that now end up at our border. Let's talk about that. So first, let's touch on Cuba. Interestingly, some new reports have come out that Cuba is going to be hosting this secret Chinese spy base to spy on the U.S. Now, John Kirby came out and said, I've seen the report. I don't think it's really that accurate. It's not really true, but It's interesting because, Cuba is one of those countries that we still have. We've sort of eased relations a little bit over the last few years, but not much. They're still under hefty embargo by the United States. The people are not able to thrive. They're right there, right off the shore of Florida. What would be your Cuba policy?
Get over it. Batista, there was a revolution. Batista lost. If Batista had been better to his people, there wouldn't have been that kind of communist revolution. But there was. Castro won. Get over it. You have a younger generation now. When I was younger, the people in Florida, particularly the huge political bloc of people who remembered being kicked out, losing their fortunes, kicked out from Batista, formed such a huge political bloc. But they now have their children and their grandchildren who are the first to say, why are we still going on and on about this? We
Yeah.
don't have to agree with everything that Cuba does. Of course, we should have healthy relationships to Cuba. And I also think, whether it comes to Cuba or any other country, I think Americans, the average American does not, I don't think the average American understands how savage and how violent some of these sanctions and embargoes are.
Yeah.
It's not the top dogs in Cuba who are suffering from this. It's the average Cuban, and we should have. It looked like you said, it looked like Obama was starting to open things up, and this is another area where everybody assumed that once Biden came in, because you had some good things done by Obama, and then Trump went, closed-hearted, mean-spirited, and you thought, oh well, Biden will fix that, and in quite a few areas he has not.
Let's talk about some of the other countries where there's sanctions and pretty strict policies against: Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan. What would be your policies with these countries?
Well, name a country.
Let's start with Afghanistan. We still are sanctioning them. We ended the war as far as troops on the ground, but have continued
Once
to
again,
bomb them with drones and sanction them and hold them back from money.
it's not hurting the top dogs at the Taliban. It's
Right.
hurting the average Afghan. Give them that money. We failed. We failed spectacularly. Own it. Do the right thing.
Venezuela. Maduro just recently went and
Well,
visited Saudi Arabia.
Maduro's not a great guy. I don't think I feel no affection for Maduro. I can't imagine that anyone does, actually. But when it comes to the sanctions against the Venezuelan people, it's that it's we need to. The paradigm itself is not working. The Venezuelan people are suffering. For us to contribute, the whole idea originally was, well, see what'll happen is that we'll put these sanctions in these countries and it will make their people really angry at their governments and then they will rise up. No, it's the opposite, because these people know who is doing this
Right.
to them. They know that it's not the Maduro. I mean, I'm not naive about Maduro, and I think many people in Venezuela are not pleased with him, but they know what American sanctions are doing.
Hmm.
So, no, I do not believe that that's a way to deal with Maduro.
What about Syria with Bashar al-Assad?
Recently there was a situation with the drone in Syria, right? And President
Mhm.
and the Russians had shot down, there was a Russian drone, I think, and it had killed an American. And Biden came out and he said, we handled it. And I remember I started making phone calls to to some friends in Washington who are in the defense and military and state. Why do we even have troops? I said, in Syria. Nobody can even tell you. Nobody can even tell you. So, once again, nothing that we're doing there is working.
Yeah.
So, I don't see how either our being there in any way, shape, or form is helping the
So
people of Syria.
when we look at these countries, and if you feel, Maduro, Bashar al-Assad, let's say the Ayatollah in Iran, or whoever it might be, if they're bad leaders, let's say you believe that their ethics, their morals are completely counter to what the United States stands for our type of democracy and freedoms. Should the United States, with you in charge as president, should the United States do something to these leaders? So you're saying you don't like the sanctions, that's just hurting the people. Do you believe there should be some sort of stance or policy or way to sort of wrangle these leaders in order to behave the way that the United States wants them to behave?
Well, there is such a thing as standing on our own values, of course. I mean, none of us should be naive about some of these people, but let's take an example of Iran. So, with Obama, there was the nuclear deal. And then Trump brings us out of the nuclear deal, and he instead exerts what he called maximum pressure. Maximum pressure means even more sanctions, things that are even making it more difficult for people there. Then, once again, we all thought, well, certainly Biden will reverse what Trump did and go back to what Obama was trying to do. And to the surprise and certainly the disappointment of many of us, he didn't. He didn't. Now we have a real conundrum on our hands because that government has behaved so horrifyingly and it's continued to behave so horrifyingly recently with the protests and so forth. Um, so it's kind of a rough time to be saying to the Ayatollah at this moment, let's make any kind of a deal. It's a
I guess
difficult one.
what I'm trying to ask is more of a it's sort of a philosophical thing of, should the United States stay out of other countries' business and just let them govern and let the people deal with their own leadership when the people are ready to deal with their own leadership, and the US should just continue to protect its own interests, do deals with these countries, and like we live our own lives, we're doing our own thing, you do your own thing. We'll interact when we need to interact when it comes to business deals and whatnot. Should the U.S. just take that sort of a stance, more of an isolationist viewpoint on it, or should the U.S. be more firm in the way that the U.S. has been in trying to manipulate these countries to behave differently? I think that's, should there be a stance of we need to change them, or should the stance be hands off, they will change themselves? Where do you fall on that? I'm sure it's a spectrum, but kind of give me an idea.
Well, my answer has to do with the spectrum. I'm not an isolationist. And I do believe we should stand on our values. But over the last 50 years, particularly, and in many cases ever since World War II, what we call standing on our values is actually transgressing against our own values, trying to use our own, sometimes imperialistic military adventures to impose actually things which are in fact not our democratic values. I met the Dalai Lama once, and he himself said to me, the people of the world do not see America as a champion of democracy. So I believe that we should stand on our values, but that does not mean we're going to hit you over the head if you don't do what we want you to do. First of all, that hitting people over the head, usually whether it has to do with sanctions or other military operations, just increases more hatred towards the United States.
Mm.
Doesn't help that country and makes us less safe rather than more safe. We need an entirely new paradigm. We are at a state where at this point in the history of the world, if we don't learn a new collaborative way of being, and it's somewhere in that spectrum that you were talking about, it's neither side, right? We must forge a new collaborative paradigm by which we wage peace on this planet, whether it has to do with the environment, on which we're going to have to learn to collaborate, AI, on which we're going to have to learn to collaborate, or nuclear bombs, on which we're going to have to learn to collaborate. We must be willing to change direction. And this is another area where the United States needs to face the fact what we have been doing is not working.
Yeah. What would be your policy then? We're seeing a lot of ramped up rhetoric on China. Like I mentioned, the report saying China is going to go to Cuba and build a base and spy on America. I mean, that tackles, for many people, especially on the right, I would say Cuba and China in one, to kill two birds with one stone. What would be your policy in regards to China, and in particular China and Taiwan?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I had not heard about this thing about a base in Cuba. But China doesn't need to have a base in Cuba to spy on the United States. So that sounds like something out of the 1980s or something. They don't need to go to Cuba. I don't understand what that is, but I will certainly read up on that. Um, I don't think China wants to go to war with the United States. And I think that the best thing we can do for Taiwan right now is to help build a more and more collaborative relationship, healthy competition with the Chinese. We don't need to be poking this bear. The United States has poked way too many bears, and we should not be poking the Chinese one at this time. They won't take it.
Mhm.
They don't need to take it. They're doing better economically than, on one hand, they're not doing so well, but then on the other hand, if you look at BRICS and India and Brazil and China and all of them together, they're actually overwhelming us. This is the thing. It's not a unipolar world anymore. The United States doesn't get to say just what we want. We have so misused the moral authority and the military, the actual military, over the last few decades. People aren't buying it. So we have to step back, try to build better relationships with China, and not be messing around with what's going on in the South China Sea. We need to not be sending American lawmakers over to Taiwan. We need to not be doing military exercises over there in a way that are clearly making Xi unhappy. Everybody said, "Oh, they won't really mess with Hong Kong. They won't really mess with Hong Kong because it's doing economically so well." Well, guess what? They mess with Hong Kong more severely and earlier than anybody thought. So we should take Xi very seriously. When Xi has said our patience is running thin, we should be very, very careful. We should be trying to help the Taiwanese, but not through this kind of military that some people would have us believe is going to work against the Chinese, because it's not. The last thing we need right now is a Cold War with the Chinese.
This sort of takes us a good segue into the Russia-Ukraine war. For many years, Russia said, we're not going to tolerate this. We're not going to tolerate your expansion eastward into the Eastern Bloc, into the Warsaw Pact. We're not going to stand for you turning Ukraine into a Western bulwark right on our borders. And if you do this, we will destroy Ukraine. They've made that really clear for a very, very long time. And now they're doing exactly what they said they would do if we continued to push. And we pushed. So I'm curious, what is your stance on the Russia-Ukraine war? I know you've said we should fund more or give more weapons to Ukraine. Where are you at with this crisis today?
There are people who seem to think that if you know how to put the word proxy in the same sentence as the word war, that you have it all figured out. Well, I don't think it's quite that simple. There are many people who just use that phrase proxy war as though that's it. This is a complicated situation. Did the United States meddle? Yeah, we obviously did. Should we have put those Aegis missiles in Poland? Absolutely not. But a lot of that conversation on the left in America today leaves out any sense of agency for the Ukrainians, for the Latvians, for the Estonians, for the Lithuanians. Look at what Finland is doing now. Finland was neutral for decades and has now joined NATO. So I do not buy the picture that Ukrainians aren't people. They're somehow cardboard cutout, and they have simply done what we told them to do. This is not the United States removing Mossadegh and putting in the Shah of Iran. I don't believe that that's what 2014 was. I believe that if you look at the way the Ukrainians are fighting right now, Kim, the kind of spirit that those people are showing, that doesn't come from people who are just working at the behest of the US State Department. So and I also resent people saying, like, they're the pro-peace candidate if they haven't figured out how we got here. No, excuse me, we all agree on how we got here. 85, 90% of what you said, I would agree with. The point is, what are you going to do now? If somebody says, okay, we're going to completely withdraw any support right now, the last thing that would happen there is peace. There would be such a crushing war and a destruction of Ukraine. There has to be a diplomatic solution. Denmark, for instance, has now offered to do a summit. They've said it can't just be Ukrainian allies. It has to also be India, also be China, also be Brazil, all of which is realistic. Like I said, it's a multipolar world now. We should be supporting those diplomatic efforts, and I absolutely would. The only question is, it's going to be a negotiated settlement. I would like to support a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine still has a right to exist. I don't buy into, even if you buy that the United States did 100% everything that you just said, which, like I said, the vast majority of what you said I agree with, that to me does not justify the imperialism or the brutality of Vladimir Putin. It doesn't. It is a standard technique of the abuser to say, you made me do it. No, 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 no. So at this point, I would like it to be a negotiated settlement. where we are, if I'm an anti-imperialist and I take a stand when the United States has behaved imperialistically, which God knows we have, to me it makes sense to be consistent and also recognize the Russian imperialism as well. So I would like it to be a negotiated settlement where Ukraine still has some existence as a sovereign state. This is to me about sovereignty. And I think that the Ukrainians have some agency here, and they have a right, and that should not be a blank check. But we're in the middle of the Battle of Bakhmut. We don't know if the counteroffensive has started or it's about to start. But this is a moment where absolutely we should be supporting all diplomatic efforts, but also I support Ukraine doing what it can to still exist.
A lot of these conflicts that we're seeing in the world, whether it be Russia-Ukraine or Israel-Palestine or what's going on with India and Kashmir, Pakistan, a lot of these conflicts are because of somebody arbitrarily drawing borders that really didn't make much sense at the time that they drew the borders. And when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, that one falls squarely on the USSR, right? They drew borders. They gave Crimea to Ukraine. They then gave a bunch of the Donbass region to Ukraine. A lot of these ethnic Russians speaking Russian, they could have drawn the border differently fundamentally, right? Same thing when it came to India and Pakistan. They could have included Kashmir into Pakistan rather than into India, and given the Muslim majority to the Muslim country, right? A lot of these borders, it's just some hierarchy person sitting on a perch decided this is where we're going to draw things, because maybe they did backroom deals and they had a buddy and they just kind of placated this. So, so where do you fall on, now we've got a lot of these conflicts that are there because of these misdrawn borders.
Right.
Let's talk about the border of Israel-Palestine. So this is one that is highly contentious, obviously one of the biggest, most contentious conflicts in our lifetime. Yeah. And obviously there is a dispute over the borders, over whose land is whose in that conflict. Where do you stand when it comes to this particular big conflict in the Middle East?
It's funny you used Jared Kushner's language just now. He said it's just a real estate dispute. No, it's not a real estate dispute. The occupation is illegal. International law does not mean that you can just occupy forever. The settlements are illegal. The blockade is at the very least immoral. Israel's going to have to deal with this flaw at its founding, just like we had a flaw at our founding. And we have to deal with it. It's a moral flaw that the United States had at our founding. It's a moral flaw that they had at theirs. Now, we have a memorandum of understanding till 2028. So that money is going there, but the United States, $3-something billion a year until 2008, I think, 2028. But we absolutely can insist that that money be used in a way that does not in any way transgress against our values, anything that has to do with the occupation, anything that has to do with the settlement, anything that has to do with Gaza. The United States, when I talked before about the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, the entire trajectory of American history has been expanding the recognition of what that means. It doesn't just mean white people. It doesn't just mean men. It doesn't just mean straight people. It also doesn't just mean Americans. So I think that our support, Russ' support for the human rights as well as the security of both peoples, should be the goal of the United States. I think that Biden has been, and Blinken, had been terribly silent, horribly silent over what has been going on there. The right-wing Israelis that are now in charge, really, they have the same thing going on in Israel now. It's much like the Trump government that we had, and a lot of them are the same people, I'm afraid. The United States should be speaking about this. The United States should be speaking up for our own values, and in this case, has to do with far more robust support for the Palestinians, and I would as president.
Yeah, that conflict is very, very difficult because, I know you don't like the language, but it does fundamentally boil down to a land dispute between the two people. One group believing that they should have land, and the other group believing they should have the land. So somebody has to go in there and say, you get this land and you get this land. And on top of that, but we're going to require that you actually adhere to this, or else we're going to withdraw support, right? Or unless you believe that there should be a one-state solution, this would be why, perhaps it is not a real estate dispute if you believe it should be a one-state solution, that the Palestinians should be integrated into the state of Israel and should be, granted all the same rights as the Israelis. I could tell you from my time in the West Bank, I spent an amount of time there with the Palestinians. They don't want that. They don't want to live with the Israelis. They hate each other. They don't want to be together. They want their own country. How would you go about? I mean, now it's like all these settlements are all over the place, like Swiss cheese, turning Palestine's West Bank into Swiss cheese. Somebody's got to step in there. So would you withdraw support to Israel if they
Once
continue to
again,
expand?
we have the memorandum of understanding until 2028. But so until that point, in the absence of legislative action, then actually that money is going there. But that money does not have to, we do have the right to say that money will not be spent on anything that has to do with activity, particularly military activity that goes against our values. So that's what we can do until 2028. And by the way, it's not like there's not a dispute. Obviously, I see that as a dispute. But when Kushner said something, and like, how could he say that? This is just a real estate dispute. Because in the mind of someone like him, it is. When you talk
Right.
about somebody needs to go in there, the United States doesn't even have the power to just go in there and say, you're going to go here and you're going to go there. I think the American president can definitely say that Israel has to deal with this. The whole world should be saying that Israel has to deal with this. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And but Israel at this point is going to have to. This is unsustainable. It reminds me of the Black Lives Matter saying, "No justice, no peace." There will not be peace there until there is justice there, and the
I could,
Israeli government one day realize
yeah,
that.
for sure. I mean, I could tell you what's happening is it's what the history books we've been taught here in the United States, which is that colonizers came in and ultimately the natives got relegated to reservations, which is where they're at now. And that is absolutely what is happening over there. The goal, it's very clear that the goal is to essentially create little Palestinian reservations, and they can just live on the reservations inside of the state of Israel, and they can kind of govern themselves on their reservations. But if they leave the reservation, they're in Israel, and that's like really obviously to me what their end goal is to turn them into natives who are now living on reservations.
I do not agree that that's how it started, but I agree that that's where it is now in the
Yeah.
hands of the far right there. And the far right and the far left both want the one state solution. And I agree with what you said about how Palestinians feel, but they're going to have to deal with this because it is unsustainable the way it is.
So we're running out of time. I want to ask you one last question. I've really enjoyed this conversation and getting your viewpoints on everything. And it really, I think you have set yourself apart from Joe Biden in many ways as to why you would be a different and better candidate than Joe Biden. My last question for you is, who is your voter? Now you've had a lot of support, growing support, especially amongst young Gen Z is really, really hot for Marianne. I'm seeing that. You're growing in the polls. Who do you think you're attracting? RFK Jr. is obviously grabbing. For him, I would say he's got a lot of voters on both sides of the aisle. He attracts people who are independent and people who even would vote for Trump. And a lot of people, it's either RFK or it's Trump, right? Who's your voter? Who are you grabbing away from Joe Biden?
Well, I like to think it's people who know that transactional politics alone will not repair this country, that there is something deeper going on here, not only in terms of the corruption, not only in terms of corporate tyranny, but in the fact that we have so deviated from the principles on which we purport to stand, and who recognize that we're going to have to look in the mirror, who recognize that we need to make a U-turn, who are attracted to my candidacy because they know, number one, that I don't stand for anything less than a U-turn, but that I would seek to effectuate that U-turn very wisely and very responsibly and very consciously. and know that in order for these changes to occur, we must have mercy and compassion for each other and for ourselves as we go about this process. And who know that this won't be done immediately, but who know that when I'm president, if I'm president, that you will get a visceral sense that the season of repair has begun. On the external level, there are two groups of people which it seems to me see me. When I'm out there, I get, you see me and I see you. Number one, Gen Z, because they're not even 20th century people. And, most of them were not even born in the 20th century. And if they were, they hung out there as babies for a little bit. They are much more vibing with the 21st century, much more holistic, much more whole person perspective. This whole mechanistic, just treat the symptom thing, they know we've got to go deeper. They're comfortable with that. And they don't see why they should have to live their lives at the effect of bad economic ideas left over from the 20th century. They recognize that. I agree with them about that. But there's another group. If we're talking about external demographics, middle-aged and older women. Older people and younger people today are like a perfect third on a piano. There's a lot of resonance. It's the people in the middle who look at someone like me, why doesn't she go away? People who are young, they hear me and they see me, and then this middle-aged and older women thing. There's an awakening. I think there's an awakening going on in this country. People on both the left and the right are beginning to recognize the corporate tyranny, are beginning to recognize that insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big ag, big chemical, big food, gun manufacturers, big oil, and defense contractors are a corporate aristocracy that are oppressing us. Their tentacles have moved into every corner of this society. And it's been this canard that, it's the people to your left who are your problem. It's the people to your right are your problem. Really, it's one of those don't look up things. It's the same people are oppressing you, those who are keeping their hold on money and power. And that's where your fascism, that marriage, unholy alliance of corporate and state power. So I think there's an awakening, but people want to repudiate it. I read a wonderful line, Abraham Lincoln talking about the Declaration of Independence. He said, it is a stumbling block and a rebuke to tyranny and oppression. And there is tyranny in this country today. It's an economic tyranny. It's an economic oppression. But we won't fix that by throwing a bomb into it. We will fix it by adhering to the principles on which we purport to stand. The way to protect our democracy is to use more democracy. That's why we should have debates. So I think there are people who recognize we have to go into those deeper philosophical dimensions. The Declaration of Independence, Kim, was not just a political document, it's a spiritual document. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. God gave all men inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every great social justice movement in the history of the United States has emerged from the churches. Among the whites in the abolitionist movement came from the early evangelical churches in New Hampshire. Many of the women who were leaders in the women's suffrage movement were Quakers. And Dr. King obviously was a Baptist preacher. So many people, whether they see it as religious or spiritual or just more human, they see it in secular terms, no, we have to go into our hearts for this one. We have to go into our hearts for this one. America has to atone. America has to make amends. America has to forgive ourselves and others. And if we can find that space, then we can work the political miracles that our ancestors have worked before us. That's, I think, who my audience is people who get that on some level.
Well, Marianne, I love seeing you out there on the campaign trail, and I think your ideas and your voice absolutely needs to be heard, and I love having somebody who is a true outsider actually running for president of the United States. A lot of people think, oh, no, it should be somebody who's a member of Congress or a former governor or a senator or comes from a political family.
The status quo, that will not disrupt itself. The status quo will not disrupt itself. I didn't mean to interrupt you, though. I'm sorry.
No, but thank you for this conversation and giving us some more insight into your platform, your ideas for this country. I only
Thank
wish
you.
you the absolute best of luck. I do hope that, I mean, look, I'm not going to hold my breath, but I hope that the Democratic Party decides to hold debates. I mean, they're not going to. They barely even bring Joe Biden out to say anything at all, let alone debate people. But I hope that there is some sort of debate that is created, or some sort of, something where people can hear on a larger scale your ideas and truly compare them to Joe Biden and decide who they would like, because of democracy, to be their representative and to run for president. So I wish you only the best of luck, and I thank you again for having a conversation about your candidacy. So people, from what I can understand, can go to your website, marianne2024.com. I've got that link down below. That is where they could donate, join, volunteer your campaign. And yeah, I wish the best of luck in
Thank
the
you.
rest of your journey in this.
Thank you. Thank you. Always nice to see you, and thank you for having me.